The Ottoman Empire was vast, powerful, and filled with rules that feel almost dreamlike to us today. Not laws of harsh punishment or war, but quiet, strange customs that ruled over the daily life of its people. Tonight, let's wander slowly through some of those forgotten halls where slippers slid silently over tiled floors, and every action had a rule hidden behind it. Not to worry, you don't need to remember any of these. You're simply here to drift gently through time, through the gentle fabric of Ottoman order. The Sultan, at the center of the empire, lived in a world that was strictly regulated, not only by politics, but by protocol so detailed it could put you to sleep. For example, no one was allowed to turn their back on the Sultan, not guards, not servants, not even high-ranking officials. They had to back away slowly, eyes cast down, sometimes exiting entire rooms in reverse. Imagine how quiet and slow those rooms must have been. Soft footsteps, careful glances, long silences, no rushing. Everything had its place. Even the way someone left a room was part of the law of honor. But these rules weren't just for the palace. In the marketplaces of Constantinople, today's Istanbul, there were inspectors known as mutasibs who wandered through the stalls checking not just weights and prices, but sounds and smells. If a baker's bread was too burnt, he could be fined. If the fishmonger's goods smelled slightly off, even if they were edible, he might be shut down for the day. These were not criminal offenses, just quiet infractions of the public peace. The empire didn't want disorder, and that included the wrong kind of scent on the breeze. Inside the homes of the Ottoman elite, the strangest rules of all were often the quietest. In a large household, the number of windows a building could have sometimes reflected status, but also had to obey the sensitivities of neighboring families. One could not build windows that directly overlooked someone else's courtyard. It wasn't just about privacy, it was about harmony, and ensuring that no family could ever feel they were being silently watched. The architecture itself obeyed the laws of social balance. And then there were slippers. Shoes were removed at the door, of course, but inside, even the sound of slippers was regulated in the Sultan's palace. In some quarters, especially near the harem, the rules demanded that slippers be so soft they made no noise at all. There's a record of leather being banned temporarily in certain rooms because it creaked too much. The quiet was part of the law. It wasn't written down on every street corner, but those who lived by it never questioned it. Quiet meant control. Silence meant respect. One of the more curious laws concerned the imperial tulip gardens. The Ottomans loved tulips deeply. During what came to be called the tulip era in the early 18th century, laws were passed to protect tulips as though they were royal blood. Theft of a tulip bulb could bring heavy penalties. Gardeners were sworn to secrecy about their planting techniques. Some tulip varieties were so precious they were guarded at night. You can imagine the stillness of those gardens, lit by oil lamps, with guards slowly pacing under the moonlight, protecting flowers that no one dared pick. Even eating had its own set of strange boundaries. In some regions of the empire, particularly where religious scholars held influence, it was forbidden to eat while standing. People had to sit down slowly and deliberately, even for a quick snack. Street vendors had benches or stools, not just for comfort, but because walking and eating was seen as improper. In large cities, this was sometimes enforced by the mutasibs, who would quietly remind people to sit, not scold them. The idea was to keep public spaces graceful and orderly. Eating was not just nourishment, it was part of your public behavior. Then, there was the rule about shadows. In certain religious complexes, particularly around major mosques, it was forbidden for market stalls to cast a shadow on the walls. Builders had to measure where the sun would land during different seasons. If your awning or goods spilled too far, you might be asked to move or change your hours of operation. The mosque's walls had to remain untouched, even by something as silent as a shadow. This wasn't enforced with soldiers or noise, just a quiet reminder or a formal notice written in elegant script, carried by an official wearing layered robes and moving slowly through the streets. And in the world of coffee, which the Ottomans helped popularize across the world, there were rules so specific they almost feel like bedtime riddles. Coffee houses were allowed, but they were watched closely. In the 16th century, one sultan banned them altogether for a time. Why? Because they became too popular. Men would gather for hours, sipping slowly, playing chess, and talking. It wasn't the coffee itself that troubled the authorities. It was the free conversation. Later, the ban was lifted, but with rules. Coffee houses could operate only at certain times. The doors had to remain open. No back rooms. Light had to spill in. Even the way the chairs were arranged could be checked. Nothing was left to chance, not even the placement of cushions. The empire extended its touch into every part of life, even the unseen ones. Soap had its own regulations. Perfumers were licensed. Tailors were registered and taxed based on the color of fabric they used. Some colors were reserved for the palace. Others were banned during periods of mourning. Wearing the wrong color during a funeral procession could bring a fine, or at least a firm warning. People didn't argue. They knew the rules like they knew the call to prayer. They accepted them not because they were afraid, but because it was part of the rhythm of living in such an old, intricate world. And now, as the soft lamps begin to dim across the winding lanes of the Ottoman world, you begin to see how everything was touched by law, but in the gentlest ways. This was not a world of blaring sirens or loud arrests. It was a world of quiet correction, silent watchers, and laws that moved as gently as silk across stone. Far away from the grandeur of palaces and courts, the countryside of the Ottoman Empire followed its own quiet patterns. To grow it, some crops were taxed differently depending on whether they were grown for sale or for personal use. A family planting olives for their own table might owe nothing, but if they pressed the oil and sold it, even in small amounts, they would be required to register with the local tax officials, not to punish them, but to keep track. Every drop had meaning. Even the smallest harvest carried a paper trail, and still there was calm. No noise, no rush, just the steady rhythm of life under the law. In the villages, the imam often acted as both spiritual guide and informal judge. About land boundaries or broken fences were settled not with lawyers, but over tea, sitting beneath shade trees, with quiet voices. The law was present, but soft-spoken. You didn't need a court date, just patience and the right words. The height of homes was regulated. A merchant could not construct a home taller than his neighbors if it risked blocking their light. They would walk the street, measuring shadows, imagining how it would feel to sit in your neighbor's courtyard and find your sunlight gone. They wanted fairness, balance, peace. Every nail, every tile had to fit into that order. One particularly strange rule governed the sale of ice. In summer, ice was gathered from distant mountains or stored underground from the winter before. It was precious and used mostly by the wealthy, but the government issued licenses for its sale. No one was allowed to hoard it. If inspectors found a merchant keeping too much in hidden stores to raise prices, they could seize it and distribute it to hospitals or bathhouses. Ice was to refresh the people, not just line the pockets of a few. Even the cold had its own quiet code, and there was a rule about water jugs. It was common to find stone fountains with cups chained nearby so travelers could drink freely. But there was a law. The cup must always be made of brass or tin, never wood. Why? Wood could rot, carry disease, or absorb odors. It sounds small, but the empire cared about these details. Clean water meant health. A brass cup meant safety. To ensure that the smallest corners of life ran smoothly in the hammams, or public baths, the rules were many and strangely specific. You could not bathe during prayer times. You could not speak too loudly. There were specific days when men and women were allowed to use the space. If someone stayed too long, the bath attendant might offer a subtle warning by adjusting the flow of steam, a gentle sign, not a confrontation. You were simply expected to know when to leave. The laws here were almost musical in how they guided human behavior. Nothing forced, just nudged softly. In the markets, one of the oldest rules was that sellers must not shout too loudly to attract customers. Market criers could call out their prices, but there were limits to how noisy they could be. The idea was not just about peace and quiet, it was about fairness, with the slow glide of a robed inspector who would simply pause, look, and if needed, speak softly to remind a seller of their tone. Not a warning, just a correction. There was a peculiar rule in the shipping ports as well. At the harbors of Izmir and Alexandria, dock workers were required to unload cargo in a specific order, based not just on weight or value, but on origin. Goods from Muslim lands had to be set down gently, never dropped, even by accident. To do so was considered disrespectful. But sacred items, books, or textiles bearing verses of the Quran were carried with two hands, often wrapped even before they left the ship. Even the youngest porter followed it without question back in the palace. The pages and young attendants lived under a system of rules so complex it resembled a silent school. They rose before dawn, dressed in layers according to their rank, and walked in specific paths depending on who might be present. No unnecessary words. To speak out of turn, even in excitement, could result in removal from service. It was learned by feeling, by repetition, by watching others until it sank into your body like breath. The Ottoman post system, though efficient, had strange limits. Couriers could not ride through certain sacred neighborhoods. They had to dismount and walk their horses quietly, even if it meant delay. Letters from high officials were carried in silk satchels, tied with seals of colored thread to denote urgency. The empire moved quickly, but not at the cost of serenity. One of the more poetic rules applied to poetry itself. In some courts, only approved poems could be read aloud at gatherings. unrest. A poem that praised love was welcome. One that spoke of rebellion, even metaphorically, was not. But again, this was enforced, not with arrests, but with invitations. Poets who crossed the line were simply no longer invited to read. Their words faded, not by force, but by silence. And as the empire aged, new rules joined the old ones, layered like soft blankets over a sleeping body. Not a second too soon, not a second too late. The man who climbed the minaret each day carried not only his voice, but the responsibility of rhythm. The law followed him, unseen, in every breath. The Ottoman world was one of order, but not the harsh kind. It was a world of gentle corrections, soft customs, and rules that lived not in books, but in gestures. You might never see them written down. You simply lived by them, and slowly, as the candles burned low and the tea cooled in its glass, you knew exactly what to do, because everyone did. In the Ottoman world, rules reached even the smallest corners of clothing. A tailor could not design garments freely without understanding the laws of fabric, color, and class. Certain colors were restricted for specific ranks. Deep blues and purples were often reserved for high officials or members of the palace. A merchant might admire such colors in the market, but he dared not wear them on the street. Tailors were trained to guide their customers, gently reminding them that some silks whispered too loudly of status. To wear above your station was to invite, not arrest, but quiet disapproval. You might be refused service at a bathhouse or ignored at a coffee stall. No confrontation, just distance. And in time, the law would press gently against you until you adjusted. Headgear too followed strange codes. The turban, more than a hat, was a symbol. Its size, fold, and fabric all spoke silently of your identity. Scholars had their own style, wrapped carefully and worn slightly off-center. Traders nodded theirs more tightly. Janissaries, the elite soldiers, wore a special white headdress called a birk with a metal emblem in front. But once retired, they were forbidden from wearing it. A soft rule, yes, but deeply observed. To cling to a uniform no longer yours was considered a quiet rebellion, and the empire did not like rebellion, even the soft, kind dot in coffeehouses, which bloomed like warm lanterns across the empire. Rules were not posted on walls, but known in hearts. You did not play games of chance for money. Cards and backgammon were allowed, but betting was forbidden. If a man lost his temper over a board game, he might be gently asked to leave and not return for several days. The owner kept order not through force, but through memory. And regulars kept each other in check, because the peace of the room mattered more than the game itself. Voices were low. Laughter was allowed, but no singing after sunset. That was a rule too. One strange law governed storytellers. These men, called metas, would perform tales in the squares or markets, switching voices to act out heroes and fools. But they were not allowed to impersonate living officials or mock religious figures. If they did, they risked being silenced. Not jailed, just forbidden to perform. Their license to speak was oral, but powerful. The people listened with wonder, but also with expectation. A meta could poke fun at a greedy merchant or a foolish husband, but not at the vizier, not at the imam. The line was invisible but firm. Cross it, and the stage vanished. In the world of guilds, rules grew like ivy. The shoemakers, the tanners, the bakers, Each trade had its own code. A baker could not open his oven before dawn. Bread had to be weighed publicly once a week by local officials to ensure fairness. If a baker was caught adding sand or ash to stretch his flour, he wasn't just fined. He might be paraded through the market holding a blackened loaf as a quiet reminder to others. Shame, not jail, was often the tool of correction, and the baker would learn. He would knead the next loaf with care. Apprenticeship itself was deeply regulated. A boy could not simply become a blacksmith or weaver because he wanted to. He had to serve under a master for years. Not even animals were outside the empire's quiet logic. In Istanbul, hundreds of cats roamed freely through the alleys, mosques, and courtyards, but they were not strays in the usual sense. The Ottomans believed that cats were protectors of cleanliness and spirit. There were rules, unspoken but followed, that a shopkeeper should always leave a bowl of water outside and a plate of leftovers. If he had them, to harm a cat was to invite shame upon your household. Even a passing soldier would pause if a cat lay across his path. He would wait, step around, or gently scoop it up and set it aside with respect. No one told him to. He just knew. One of the stranger and more delicate rules was in the handling of books. In religious schools and among the scribes, it was expected that no book, especially not a religious one, should ever touch the ground. Students would carry their Qurans in cloth sleeves and always with two hands. If one did fall, everyone would pause and someone would bend slowly to retrieve it. The pages might be kissed, not because it was required, but because that was the rhythm of respect. You followed it without being told. You watched the elders, and you absorbed the law in silence. There were curious restrictions on naming children. Certain names were discouraged for the average person, especially names that echoed the sultan or sacred historical figures. A child named Suleiman, if not born into nobility, might find doors closed. Teachers might shorten the name. Friends might call him something else entirely. It wasn't forbidden, but the culture had a memory. It reminded you where you stood and how to name your place within it. Even the act of drinking water carried small rules. In public fountains, which dotted the streets of cities and villages, it was known that you must let the next person drink before refilling your own cup, and if someone came with a jug, you stepped aside. Fountains were often built by charity, endowed by a family or in memory of a loved one, and thus were sacred. A boy who splashed or wasted water might get a quiet scolding from an elder nearby. Not loud, just a hand on the shoulder and a word. Water was a gift, and the empire wanted you to treat it that way. Travel across provinces required permission, especially for traders. You could not simply wander from one district to another with goods in tow. You needed a stamped document called a mur tezkeresi. Without it, the guards at the gates might stop you, question you, and send you back. The roads were watched, for danger but for order. Merchants knew this. They kept their papers dry and folded in leather, sometimes even scented with rosewater, not because they had to, but because the law was both ritual and routine. In certain coastal towns, fishing rights were dictated by season, tide, and ancient tradition. A family might have the right to fish a particular cove for generations, but only at dawn, and only with nets of a certain size. If another family casts their nets nearby at the wrong time, they wouldn't be arrested. Instead, an elder would appear, with a slow walk and perhaps a small wooden cane. He would stand quietly on the shore. That was enough. The younger fishermen would pull in their nets. No argument, just a soft return to the rule. Inside the palace itself, there were layers upon layers of strange etiquette. Eunuchs who served the harem were ranked by age, by voice, even by stride. The chief black eunuch, a powerful figure, walked with slow purpose. He never turned his back on a door if the women inside were of royal blood, not because he feared them, but because the rule said he should not. And in those halls, rules carried more weight than the stone beneath his feet. Food in the palace followed equally delicate customs. The sultan's meals were prepared in silence, tasted by a taster, and served by the chief steward with a bow. No one else touched the dish once it left the steward's hands. Even if the sultan chose not to eat, no explanation was required. The food would be removed, and the same quiet choreography would begin again with a different platter. It wasn't about hunger. It was about balance, symbol, and order. There was a rule about gifts. If you visited a higher official, even just a village headman, you brought something small, a bundle of grapes, a cloth, a sweet, not to bribe, but to honor the role. And the official, in turn, never opened the gift in front of you. That too was a rule. Gratitude was shown, not in excitement, but in calm acceptance. The next time you visited, you might see the cloth folded on a chair, or taste the grapes pressed into jam. That was the thank you. Nothing more was needed. Among shepherds in the hills of Anatolia, there were ancient codes. You never let your flock graze near someone else's spring, even if it was unguarded. And if a lamb strayed too far, you returned it by hand, sometimes walking miles to do so. In return, when your own lamb vanished, it often found its way back. The same way, no courts, no records, just old rules passed between hands that worked the land at night. When the call to prayer echoed from distant minarets, there were rules for the city's lights. Oil lamps in mosques were kept burning until the last prayer. If one flickered out, a boy would climb silently with a fresh wick. And at home, families would lower their voices during prayer time, not because they feared enforcement, but because silence had become a habit during those hours. Even travelers knew this. When they heard the first notes of the muezzin, they paused wherever they were. A quiet stood over the empire like a warm wool blanket. These rules, odd, intricate, they held together people of many languages, faiths, and climates, from the snow of the Balkans to the heat of Arabia. The empire whispered its laws into every corner, not always through soldiers, often through bakers, mothers, shopkeepers, and shepherds. The rules didn't shout, they hummed, and that hum was the empire's heartbeat. There were also rules about colors. Certain dyes were reserved for the palace, for officials, or for particular ceremonies. Deep imperial red, extracted from insects or rare plants, was once so prized that wearing it without status could draw unwanted eyes, not punishment, just stares, whispers, maybe a merchant who suddenly refused to sell to you. In contrast, white cotton was the color of humility, of students and servants. You could wear it anywhere, but if you wore it to a wedding, some guests might wonder if you misunderstood your place in the court of law. The judge, or qadi, did not wear special robes or sit above the people. He sat on a low cushion behind a plain desk. Yet his word shaped entire villages. One curious rule was that he could not accept even a sip of coffee while on duty. If someone brought a tray, he would let it sit untouched until his final case had been heard. The reason was simple: no taste, no favor, no distraction. Justice, in the Ottoman mind, had to be clean, cool, and completely awake. In the bustling spice markets, there were informal codes of trade. A seller could not raise prices too sharply after the Friday prayer. It was understood that this was the time when poorer men bought for the weekend with whatever coins remained. A shopkeeper who ignored this might not lose business, but he would lose respect. And in those crowded lanes, reputation was more valuable than gold. A respected merchant could sell out by noon. A clever one without trust might sit with full baskets and no customers. Barbershops, too, had their customs. More than just haircuts, they were places of advice and community. A man entering would greet everyone present, not just the barber. And if someone else was already in the chair, you waited your turn without asking who arrived first. The barber knew. He kept track with nods, glances, sometimes even jokes. But if you complained or tried to skip ahead, he might simply put down his blade and say, "Next." You were no longer welcome that day, not banned, just quietly dismissed by the rhythm of the room. In villages, the ovens used for baking bread were often shared, one oven used by 10 families. The rule was simple. You marked your dough with a distinct stamp, sometimes a family symbol carved into a wooden paddle, and you waited your turn, no matter how hungry the children were, no matter how quickly your fire burned. And if someone else's bread came out to brown, too early, too thin, you didn't laugh or complain. You wrapped it in cloth and delivered it to their door. Bread was sacred, more than food. It was the bond between neighbors. There were unspoken rules about silence. In the early morning, before sunrise, streets were walked gently. Even in the capital, a cart might roll slower. A vendor setting up his stall might unwrap his goods with care, not because someone demanded it, but because there was a shared softness in those hours. The empire woke in layers, from the to the market to the mosque, and no one wished to break that chain with a shout or clatter. It was like watching the sun rise without blinking dot in the bathhouses, or hammam's rules turned into ritual. You entered barefoot, wrapped modestly, and greeted the attendants with a bow of the head. You did not speak loudly. You did not rush. And if a stranger asked for help scrubbing his back, you agreed, not because it was polite, but because it was part of the ceremony. The bath was a place to return to the beginning, to strip away dust, noise, and ego. And so you behaved not like a guest, but like a reflection in the water, quiet, respectful, briefly clean. In military camps, orders were strict, but beyond official commands, there were deeper customs. A soldier did not sharpen his blade at night. He did not sing loudly unless given permission. And when the meal was served, he did not take the first bite until the lowest ranking man had eaten. It was a quiet reminder that in war, the weakest must survive first. Strong men would have more chances, but the youngest, the thinnest, the most tired, those were the ones who needed feeding most. The rule was never written, but it was obeyed all the same. in desert outposts. Where water was everything, there was a peculiar law among camel drivers. You could not tie your camel too close to another at the resting point. Camels, if crowded, grew irritable. They could fight, spit, or bite, and one quarrel could scatter the whole caravan. So the rule was this: always leave the width of one sleeping man between camels. If you broke it, you'd find your rope moved by morning, not cut, not stolen, just gently shifted by someone who valued peace more than pride. During times of mourning, a family might hang a simple cloth outside their home. It was not black, nor marked by words, just a pale sheet fluttering in the wind, and that was enough. Neighbors would lower their voices. Children would be told to play elsewhere. The baker might send a loaf. The tea seller might pass by without asking for coin. For 7 days, the house became part of a wider circle, not isolated, but embraced in quiet. No laws enforced it, just memory, just rhythm, just the empire breathing gently around its own. In art, especially calligraphy, strange customs bloomed. A master calligrapher might write a line of scripture 100 times before showing it to a student, and a student, even if talented, might not be allowed to sign their name until they had copied their teacher's work for 3 full years, not as punishment, as preparation, as reverence. The ink, the paper, the curve of a single letter, it all carried weight. The rule was not to create, it was to listen, to watch. And when your hand moved without thought, then you could begin. Ottoman life was filled with such quiet rules. They did not draw borders, they drew breath. They slowed the heart, guided the hand, and shaped the day from sunrise to dusk. You could live your whole life and never hear them spoken aloud. But they lived in the way tea was poured, shoes were placed outside a door, or a prayer mat was folded just so. They lived in pauses, in glances, in the soft turning of a door latch at night, locking the world outside with a final sigh. There were even rules about storytelling itself. In coffee houses, where men gathered to sip dark, bitter cups under lantern glow, the storyteller, called a meta, held a carved walking stick and a simple scarf. He used the stick to tap the floor, to call silence, or to mimic footsteps in a tale. The scarf might become a woman's veil, a merchant's cloak, or the sail of a ship. But he could not change costume. He could not leave the mat. All the magic had to come from voice and stillness. And if someone interrupted, he would pause not to scold, but to wait. The rule was simple. The story did not compete. It waited for silence, like the moon waits for clouds to pass in the capital. Where courtiers moved through tiled halls and under domed ceilings, there were complex rules of movement. You could not walk directly behind the sultan. Even if he summoned you, you had to approach from the side, and you never touched him unless offered the right. Even his shadow was sacred in old poems. Once, a man stepped too close and was gently redirected by a silent guard, not punished, just moved, like a leaf in the wind, placed back on the path. Some rules were old superstitions, dressed in daily habits. You never swept the threshold after dark. You never passed scissors from hand to hand without placing them down first. If a mirror broke, you wrapped the pieces and placed them outside before dawn. These were not enforced by law, but they lived in grandmother's warnings and in the way children hesitated at open doors. Each little custom was a whisper from centuries. passed, soft as smoke, shaping the air of the home. Among musicians, there was a curious tradition. When playing for the court, they did not look at the audience. Eyes were lowered, focused on strings or reed. If applause came, they bowed without rising, because music was seen not as performance, but as offering, not for praise, for peace. Some say a certain note, played just before sunset in the imperial courtyard, could stop even the guards from marching. No one knows which note it was, or if it was ever real. But the rule remained: play with respect, not pride, in the kitchens of the Topkapi Palace, where hundreds of dishes were prepared each day. There was a rule of silence in the final hour before serving the sultan. No shouting, no clatter. Cooks moved like dancers. Blades whispered over herbs. Bowls passed from hand to hand without a word. It was believed that noise disturbed the taste, that food absorbed mood. And so the last moments were like prayer, quiet, intent, devoted. If something burned, no one cursed. They simply began again. Rules touched even dreams. In some households, it was said that if you dreamt of falling teeth, you must bite a pomegranate before noon. If you dreamt of a black horse, you must not cross running water until evening. These were not scientific ideas. They were threads in the quilt of belief. To follow them was not fear. It was a kind of comfort, like wrapping yourself in a pattern. Your ancestors once wove a way of saying, I belong, I remember, I am part of this. At sea, Ottoman sailors had their own codes. You could not whistle into the wind. It was thought to invite storms. You tied your hammock with 3 knots, not 2, for balance and luck. And when the call to prayer echoed across the deck, even non-Muslims aboard would pause their work, not to pray, just to honor the stillness. The rule was not religion, it was rhythm. It was a way of keeping time with something older than the tide. In border towns, where traders spoke 5 languages before noon, rules were flexible but still sacred. You did not cheat a man who had slept under your roof. You did not sell faulty goods on market day, for word would travel faster than horses. And if a caravan leader died on the road, his pack was untouched until a judge opened it in the next town. Even thieves, it was said, would not rob a dead man's cargo, because that cargo might be carrying trust. The Janissaries, elite soldiers, raised in strict discipline, had perhaps the most curious rule of all. They were forbidden to grow beards. A clean face showed obedience, showed that their identity came not from tribal roots, but from service. A beard, in many cultures, was a sign of age or freedom, but a Janissary's face had to be unreadable. A mask of unity, shaved each morning, not for style, for the symbol. Their very appearance was a rule, and they wore it with pride. In gardens, rules followed the wind. The tulip, prized by sultans and poets alike, had its own festivals. But gardeners knew when not to touch a bulb. If the moon was waxing, you waited. If the soil felt too warm, you paused. It wasn't science as we know it. It was rhythm, born from generations of observation. A garden, like a court, had moods. The wrong act at the wrong time could ruin a season. So the rule was patience, always patience. Even beggars had codes. In Istanbul, a blind beggar might sit at one gate, a wounded veteran at another. They did not compete. Each had his place. Each was known, and they would not beg in mosques during prayer. They waited at the edge, their hands open not for coin, but for presents. It was said that giving alms before prayer brought double blessings, but it was also said that a beggar who smiled in silence brought more than any words could ask. At the end of life, strange rules softened grief. A widow could not light her own stove for 7 days. Neighbors brought food. Friends took turns sitting with her at dusk, not to talk, to sit, to share the silence of absence. And on the 40th day, a candle was lit at dawn, then carried outside and left to burn out on its own. No one touched it, no one explained it, but everyone understood. The Ottoman Empire was vast, from snowy mountains to desert plains, from Greek isles to Persian borders. Its laws were written in ink, but its rules were carried in breath, in hand, in glance. You could live by them without knowing them. You could follow them without fear. They were not enforced, they were felt. They filled the space between orders and freedom, between tradition and choice. And in that space, people built a way of life, not of grand gestures, but of gentle agreements. So many strange rules, and yet none of them truly strange. Only forgotten, only quiet, only waiting to be remembered when the tea steams, the bread rises, or the storyteller taps his stick once against the floor and begins.